it. And so I'm going to redo our topic for last week. Our topic for last week was emphasizing or excuse me, maintaining emphasis. And any conversation about maintaining emphasis is a conversation about the rule of three. One thing I don't talk much about is kind of the way that the rule of three is a part of the entire practice throughout. So sometimes we look at the rule of three as counterbalance, which it is, because that's what counterbalance means. It means that you're constantly going back and forth. It means that you're constantly forgetting and then remembering, forgetting and then remembering. And the rule of three is a redirection back to the practice. So Donna, do you have a second? Do you want to explain what the basics of the rule of three is? What is the rule of three for the rewatchers?
I'm sorry, we're moving a little slow. I've got COVID now.
Well, there you go. But you don't have to answer if you have COVID. We'll give you a pass. Yeah, maybe we'll definitely do a pass. And that is the rule of three. It's dismissed. Okay, I went ahead and muted you just for the sake of the coughing into the whole microphone thing. You're all good though. Are you at least feeling okay? Because you look like you're feeling fine. Just a little bit of congestion from the COVID. Yeah.
It makes for coughing spells. And I'm physically just tired, weak.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I'm not coughing much, but when I do, it's in a spasm. So, sorry.
Okay. Well, that will teach Donna to go to the clubs at all hours of the night and contract COVID from the kids. That's how it goes.
Is that what you've been up to, Donna?
That's how it goes. We're all fine when we have our little shelters of safety, but once we go to the clubs, all bets are off. Okay, so I'll explain. Oh yes, Donna, did you have something to add?
All right, I think it's over.
It's other? What do you mean?
I think it's over.
COVID?
No.
Oh, you're
coughing
spelling.
spell.
Okay, yeah. All right, do you want to recapitulate the basic premise of the rule of three?
Well, we're really always going back to establishing presence, right? So, and the thing that gets in our way is thought. So we can't rule out thought completely because we think. So a rule of three is a way to evaluate whether the thought that's going through our head is something habitual, something repetitive, or not making us feel good. And if that's the case, we have to go back to presence. I'm sorry. I guess I can't talk. Sorry.
No, you're okay. I put you on the spot and you were not ready for it. But that's it exactly. So that is the rule of three. So we are going back to presence, and there's two things that are occurring. We're going back to presence, and we're going back to a deliberate direction of the mind, right? Which is back to the present moment and back to, depending on where you're at in the practice, back to what you're doing in the practice. And that's what I was going to kind of touch on a little bit, is the rule of three goes through the entire extent of the bridge practice, the Qigong practice. It doesn't start that way, because basic alignment, we kind of just ease up a little bit. So it could look like this. Someone could start with basic alignment and then quit. And they'll still have a lot of good strategies of becoming present. And maybe they've learned some other things. Now they have strategies to implement those other things that potentially they've learned. And that's fine. Now, if somebody starts in the counterbalance phase, then they're going to get a lot of strategies to bring their mind back to the present moment, where they can operate from a more present way forward. in their daily activities.
Yeah, can I just interject that
Yes.
the majority of the practice for a lot of us in the beginning is just noticing when you're not. You know, you said if you're in counterbalance, then you get a lot more strategies, and which means that you've already progressed past the point of noticing, feeling the difference between being present and not being present. And that's what we call remembering and forgetting. And we kind of say it quickly as if it's a no big deal thing, but it is the crux of everything. Is remembering is requires you to notice. And in the beginning, there's an overall amount of thinking that we think is normal, that everybody does and is normal behavior. And so sometimes now in class we say we just go back to the practice. The answer is always go back to the practice, and that is you know, this whatever strategies you have chosen in advance. But it's truly the crux of the practice to even know the difference, to really feel that um, we can hustle ourselves to think that we're practicing when we're not. You know, Jean has given the example many times. Yeah, that moron cut in front of me, and I'm angry about that he, you know, is driving recklessly, and I know where my mind is at. It's on that moron and how reckless he's driving and how bad that is. So we can hustle ourselves to think that we're practicing just because we know we can recognize what the direction of our mind is. It doesn't mean it's one that's chosen. And are we present? Are we actually present? The guy has cut us off, he's driven away, or he ended up behind us because he really didn't get anywhere from cutting us off. But regardless, nothing is happening in the moment other than our thoughts about what just happened before. So the noticing the opportunity to notice what thoughts are going on in our heads and how much of them are they chosen by us, or are they just habitual repetitive thinking, is really the brunt of the practice. And it took me a very, very long time just to get to 50%, where I was remembering 50% of the time. And it was a huge relief to get, when I got to 50%, I could feel the weight of thought out of my brain. It was a huge weight, but it took a long time. It took a lot of devil's advocating in class. It took a lot of, why are we doing this again? Like we were talking about techniques and things, and why do I need to notice the color blue? Like this isn't working, you know, that kind of thing. And it's just I used to actually say to myself, just shut up and practice. Just shut up and practice. Like, you know, the reasons, we could talk about them again. Somebody can remind you again. But really and I can see how you skipped over it, because we take it for granted a lot in class sometimes, that really is the brunt of everything. And it's very simple. That's what I mean by it, that it's simple. It's not easy, but if we're making it really complicated, then we've forgotten the simplicity of what we're trying to do, which is be in the present moment. That's really it. So yes, extending a point of attention, emphasizing a point of focus requires requires the acquired skill of noticing that you're not in the present moment. And that's a big thing.
Yeah, I would say that's a big thing. I could kind of give a visual representation. So I'll draw our infinite timeline because it has two arrows on either side. So you know that's infinity. And then we have our human. And then we have what I call the hydrostasy bubble, or our field of perception. And I've never played Pokemon, but I'm told that this figure right here looks like a Pokemon ball. But I don't know anything about Pokemon other than that. So when we first start the practice, I would say that this center is We'll just say it's peace, but there's a type of solidity to it. There's a type of firmness. To being more centered, more balanced. It's just like if you were on a surfboard, you know, when you are surfing and you do have your balance, you feel more ebb and flow, more peaceful. You feel more solid on your surfboard. You feel more firm, and maybe you can do some tricks. I don't know. When we first start this practice, these arrows are the direction of attention. And typically, the direction of attention is going to go outside of our immediate environment. Now, I'll talk about how this really looks to me. I'm just kind of drawing it this way for the sake of the discussion. But it actually doesn't look like this to me. It looks like something else. And I think I bring it out in the Igong book. And that will be the best way to eliminate hustling yourself. Because you can talk shit about the driver on the street, but is your attention in one of your Igong predetermined points? The answer is yes or no. So if you're paying attention to the reflections and the shadows and, you know, breaking the horizon while cussing out that driver, then in a way, you're also doing your practice.
I'm glad you said that. I was going to ask a question about that, so you just answered it.
Did that answer it? Okay, good. Now, in the average mind, what is most common? That's not a derogatory term. That's just a statistical term. What is occurring most commonly in the cognition of the average human being? Their attention is going towards thinking and is taking them outside of their bubble of peace, outside of the present moment, because that's where this bubble exists. This bubble exists in the present moment. And you either come inside of it and you pay attention to it, or you don't. And on average, most minds are going well outside of their immediate environment to entertain, I don't know, problems, career desires, we'll call it mating rituals. You'd be surprised how much of human behavior just traces back to mating rituals. And if I were that scientist voice, you know how when you watch nature channels, there's that scientist voice as he's like talking out what people are doing. I could do that with the human experience because it would be very similar. The mating rituals of the human being are quite elaborate, and they're all over the place. They're literally embedded in everything. And it would kind of make sense because we're biological creatures. So, you know, that's not the end of the world to a certain extent. Now, what the rule of three does, in the beginning, it seems heavy, the rule of three does, because we've gone from a lifetime pretty much of not giving the present moment our deliberate attention. And it feels like work. It feels a little bit difficult or tricky to go back to points of attention that have been predetermined. Eventually, like Donna said, it starts to feel like relief. It starts to feel like you're coming back to peace, solid, firmness. But in the beginning, it doesn't. In the beginning, this is why I use the terms battlegrounds and things like that, because that's what it feels like. There were times where I was redirecting my mind, had to be thousands of times a day. But I would consider that more warrior training because there was a total commitment to feeling peace. There was an unbending desire to feel more relaxed, to feel more peace, to feel more deliberate, to feel more firm, those words that I used. So the way that we interact with the rule of three is going back to the present moment using at least 3 points of attention plus our voice of power or our productive dialogue. So you're talking your practice out. You're talking yourself back to the present moment. If somebody just played with this in the counterbalance phase of training, they're going to get a lot of opportunity to see their own mind, to see their own thoughts. It could lead to positive thinking if that's what they're into. And it could lead to a wide variety of changes in the person. I can't read that. Oh, P1 plus P2 equals, yeah. That's one of our old equations for flow. Still works.
Yeah, it's been on my table, like, and it came with me in my move. P1 plus P2 plus VP equals Q.
Plus VP.
Voice of power.
Ah, yeah, we'll go with that. So the idea is that if a person does the first two stages of the Qigong practice, they can still set themselves up for better cognition overall. They'll have a more healthy interaction with their own mind and their own life experience. Does that make sense? It's a very simple thing that the rule of three will do. And in the beginning, it doesn't have to be 1,000 times a day. It can just be when things aren't going your way. Of course, that's not embodiment. That's not going to lead to some of the other aspects of the practice necessarily. But I could see some people being perfectly content with that, at least in the beginning. So this idea of when our attention is going away from our bubble, we bring it back into the bubble. And in the Qigong practice, we actually imagine and establish a bubble of perception. This is how I see the human mind. Have you ever seen something traveling underwater, and when it gets to a certain depth, it implodes, it crushes on itself? Have you ever seen that, like in TV or anything like that? Yeah, okay. So when something is going down a certain depth, the weight of the water, all that pressure will crush whatever it is, and it implodes. So the opposite of explode, right? Explode is something very rapidly going outwards. Implode is something very rapidly going inwards. So while I drew that picture with the circles outside of the bubble, that's not how it looks. That's not how I see the energy. What I see is the human mind going away from its bubble of perception. And you can imagine your bubble of perception as far as the eye can see, as far as the ear can hear, as far as you can perceive light. So as far as your proprioception will go into the environment, right? I can't smell what other people, thank goodness, probably, but what other people are cooking in their apartments because it's not available in my bubble of perception. Does that make sense when I say the words bubble of perception? This little field of perception that we have around us, it's very spherical. But you can't hear down the street. That's beyond your bubble of perception. I can't necessarily, I say beyond, we don't know what will be beyond someday, but for the sake of keeping things a little bit more useful, we'll talk about the bubble of perception in a more basic way. Now, what I see is the human mind chasing streams. It gets caught in a stream. Thinking in itself is just thinking in itself, but what the human being actually does is a thought is introduced, and then they kind of catch on to that thought, and that turns into a rapid stream of thought. And the mind is actually going in on itself. It's like collapsing in on itself, creating little bubbles that we call problems, bills, career, public adoration, acceptance from our social groups, whatever we're creating, political unrest, social, civic unrest, these things that we think about. It's actually our mind is going inside, and we're creating these little bubbles of perception that are kind of imploding on each other. Now imagine something that's falling down in the water and it's just continuously imploding though, right? So when something implodes, it gets infinitely, it gets significantly smaller because the pressure and the weight from the ocean is pushing down on it, and it's crushing it, in a manner of speaking. So rather than it being crushed, tiny, it just keeps crushing in on itself. That's how I see the human mind, the average mind. When we're looking into our cell phones, we're creating a bubble of perception that is not a part of the present moment. It's in this little place that we call the internet. When we're Facebook surfing, when we're looking at all of our different apps, when we're looking at the news, when we're doing these different things, we're creating these little tiny bubbles of perception inside of our brain, and attention, rather than going out into the world, is imploding on itself. That's how I see the human mind. Does that make sense?
Yes, and each of them has a current or buildup because of all the thought around it. of its own. So that's why the driving the car and somebody cutting you off is a good example, because if the guy cuts you off and you're still upset about it, and it already happened, and if you are still holding points of attention, then you're still practicing, and being angry for a moment is not, hasn't pulled you completely out of your practice. However, if that incident causes you to start thinking about how people in society don't have, or ever since COVID, people can't think straight. And, COVID would never have happened if we didn't have that president. And then, and the CDC and the blah, blah, and Tony Fauci and whatever else, is there is the current of those little things. So now you're not, the incident itself no longer happened. You're not only not in the present, but you're in those streams, those currents, or whatever you call them, that we had going on all along, and you got swept away in that current, and you're not practicing at all.
Exactly. And so with Qigong, it's going to be very clear what we mean by practicing, because you will have points of attention that have been predetermined for you. And so there is no chance that you can hustle yourself. So, people do often say, well, I know what I'm paying attention to, Ernest, it's the TV. And it's like, okay, that's not really what I mean. But how does a person distinguish deliberate from the habitual tendencies? Because it feels like they're doing it on purpose until they actually do it on purpose. And then you can feel that distinction between the mind going in its habitual grooves, or the mind being deliberate and going where you want it to go at all times. Now, remember, in counterbalance, we're not talking about at all times. So it's just maybe when, like Donna was mentioning, when a person really notices that they're starting to go beyond their center, their equilibrium. We talk about that a lot in Tai Chi. Well, I translate that to the human mind as well. We have central equilibrium. Where is your central equilibrium here? Or are you all over the place? Have you lost your center and now you're just, chasing streams? That's the best way to do it, or to describe it, is at first you start to actually go with the stream. Like you got into a roaring river and you're swimming with it. And then before you know it, there's nothing you can do. It feels like there's nothing you can do. Of course there is, but now it feels like the river is just sweeping you. It's just taking you away. So in the counterbalance phase, a person could use this practice to simply remind themselves of that and come back to the moment, and that's fine. And if a person quits the practice at the second phase or the second layer, which is counterbalance, they're still going to be more in charge of their own mind than if they weren't doing it at all. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think that also we're a scorekeeping culture.
Oh, yeah.
And whether it's a physical activity or not, if I hurt myself and I'm recovering and I think I'm ready to get back to the gym, and I go to touch my toes and it's so far, like if I'm far from what I think is the goal that I need to achieve, I can feel more discouraged. So the thing with the practice for me, a significant thing was I was frustrated by how often I was forgetting, how little I was remembering. I was scorekeeping the whole time. And I was frustrated by how far I had to go. And there's no win, because that's just another hurdle you get off. When you remember, you're like, gosh, then you got to go through the whole self-flagellation, judgment, opinion before you get back to the practice. So let me throw some more resistance in my own way so that I can get back to the practice. And at some point, when you recognize that the practice is serving you, or you've just made a decision, this is what I'm going to do. I believe I can't find anything contradictory in my mind to fight about why this was a ridiculous thing to even want. I know that it's possible, and I know that's the desire that I want. And so every remember is a win. Every remember is a win. did that. I'm still scorekeeping, but at least it kept me from beating myself up, which was, one of my big battlegrounds. And so it was like, I remembered. Oh, there it is.
Mhm.
There it is again. And then it became humorous sometimes, like, wow, look at me doing that thing again. But yeah, 50-50 point was a big relief. And I think it went a lot faster for me at that point
Mhm.
in the progression of my practice, or at least it felt easier to me. Um, and I felt more enthusiastic about it than it was in the first half. The first half was arduous.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I don't know any other way to deliver it that it wouldn't feel arduous. There's this idea that, nothing should feel like work, everything should feel good. This practice ain't it, because there's definitely a time, especially when we're seeing how much we forget, that the practice feels like work, especially Qigong, because they will be points that have been established for you. So you're either going back to at least 3 points of attention using your self-talk to guide you. That's the rule of 3. You guide yourself back to the practice using your internal self-talk. When you do that, you're interrupting the continuity of that flow that's taking you away from the present moment and from your practice. So using your own words, I'm going back to the moment, going back to peripheral vision, talking to myself in this way. I'm doing the hand motion just because that's usually a part of how I do the rule of 3, is I usually have some sort of physical aspect to that as well, which is fine because that's a point of attention. I'm doing it on purpose. Sometimes when I show people Qigong, I really talk them through it. And I realized, I was telling Shayna yesterday, that I don't do that for myself sometimes. Like I'll just do the movements but I don't kind of guide myself as much as I would like. So that's kind of something I've been paying attention to. But in terms of scorekeeping, just this morning, I was about to do a little bit of my practice, a little bit of standing. And then I look on Instagram or whatever, and there's this like 9-year-old kid, and he's doing push-ups on 2 fingers, and it's the kid with the nunchucks. We've all seen him. He is training for something that I can't even imagine. And I can't scorekeep to that. Like I could, but how beneficial is that going to be for me? Unless that's my desire to really, be like that. And then that could be fuel and motivation or whatever, but it's not. It's like, okay, here's this 9-year-old kid that could probably kick my ass. Like, if we're being honest, the kid's fast. He's got some strength. If he knows where to hit me, it's going to hurt. So let's not scorekeep. I don't think that's completely necessary, unless there's a way for you to find motivation through it. That is possible, but it's not probable. It just depends on how we're looking at it and how, our mind is shaping around that.
Yeah, my scorekeeping was against myself. It really wasn't
It
against
usually is.
anyone else.
Yeah. So here is, and then I could take any questions, but here are a couple principles that we're working with. So one of the primary principles is balance. Now, a lot of things claim to use balance as one of their founding principles, but then they violate it. They violate it in all sorts of ways, and they lose their own balance. So Tai Chi is a practice that's supposed to be fundamentally around balance. But I've seen people who they've let their Tai Chi practice get out of balance. Before you know it, they're doing Tai Chi from the time that they wake up, from the time that they go to bed. They got Tai Chi bumper stickers. They're in Tai Chi clubs. They got Tai Chi t-shirts, and you can't talk to them for 2 seconds without them bringing up Tai Chi. It's getting imbalanced. Does that make sense? And so someone says, can you practice Tai Chi too much? The answer is yes, you can. You can do anything too much if it's getting out of balance and it's starting to become habit or unconscious momentum. Does that make sense? I just used Tai Chi as an example, but it could be anything. So a lot of different practices or different schools of thought, if that's what this is, I don't know, but they say that balance is a part of their principle, but then they go from one extreme to the other, or they view one extreme as better than the other. This practice won't do that. So we don't go from thinking all day nonstop to the idea of absolutely no thought at all. At one point in the practice, we are completely self-absorbed. All of our attention, those thought bubbles, that I was talking about that implode on themselves, that's a person just thinking about themselves, thinking about their desires, what they want, what they're going to do, what they need to figure out, how they're going to do this, how they're going to do that. And it will all trace back to self. But we don't go to no self. I don't go to this. I've never once said that we're going to go to a place where there will just be no self. We will completely secede from the ego and be one with yada, yada. I've never said that because this practice wouldn't allow for that, because it is built on the principle of balance. Does that make sense? That is a fundamental difference from a lot of the things that I see. Even though they say that balance is one of their principles, they'll still go to an opposite extreme. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a great point.
And depending on how quick they go to that opposite extreme is how much and how fast the suffering will ensue. So existing in an extreme will cause suffering. I am not a mind reader. I am not a clairvoyant. I don't actually know what that is. I don't see the future. So I don't always know what suffering, how it's going to look for a person, or what kind of suffering they're going to create for people around them. But it is a guarantee that if we are outside of our bubble of balance, even if the bubble will start to change, it will start to move rapidly to try to include that in extreme as a part of its balance. But that process can be very tumultuous, and it can cause a lot of psychological and physical suffering. Does that make sense? So one of the foundational principles that we stick to is the principle of balance. I'm not looking to go from one extreme to the other. I'm looking to balance everything out. So we talk about habit. We talk about below and above a threshold of active recognition. If your mind is always above the threshold of active recognition, guess what? There's a part of your mind that's also below the threshold of active recognition. Your body and your mind is perceiving your environment even if you're not aware of it at all times. So if you're aware of it at all times and unaware of it at all times, bada bing, we have balance. So it's still balanced. Habit, I'm not going to say never build a habit. I would never intentionally do that, actually, honestly. I would never intentionally try to build a habit, but the mind wants to. That's what the brain does. The brain wants to keep you safe. It wants to process things onto memory so that you can just remember it rather than continuously relearning it. And so habits are going to come up. And when you see the habit, then you're taking energy away from it with this practice so that it doesn't get unconscious momentum or, momentum from being below active recognition. Does that make sense? One of the key characteristics of this practice is what I call impeccable self-awareness, not self-control, self-awareness. You are aware of your actions. You are aware of your thoughts. You are aware of your emotions. You're aware of how you're affecting other people, potentially. Does that all make sense? And then I would add one of the other founding principles of this practice is I call it non-interference. And I misspell that word interference often, but at least I'm saying it correctly. Is that one correct, Donna? Interference, non-interference. Okay. So and I'm going to save this whiteboard.
You need an R in there.
I do, yes, but I can't put it in now. It's too late. Because it won't let me change. So here's what I mean by non-interference, and we'll just make sure that this is clear so that we understand what we're talking about. And you know how a lot of times people will say you go with rather than against, we're not trying to control, non-interference. This is what I'm talking about. So ultimately what we want is a smooth flow of energy. And I'm being very general with these words. There's other ways that we could look at this. We could look at it as your electrical system in your body, electrical nervous system. We could look at it very literally like that. Interference is anything that interferes with this flow. Does that make sense? Very basic. And then I could do a whole lesson on what this flow is, but we've done that before. And then just for the sake of the discussion, I won't do that as much. But the number one thing that is causing interference in this flow is the way that we're thinking outside of the present. We're thinking in the moment, but we're thinking, creating bubbles inside of our brain that are taking us outside of the present moment, outside of our bubble of perception, I should say, because you're never outside of the present moment. That's one of the ironic things about everything we talk about, is you've never been out of the moment a second in your life. You've always been there. So every time that we create these little bubbles inside of our mind, especially if they're repetitive, habitual, not making us feel well, if it's habitual, that's a big one. Habitual in itself is a reason to redirect. I don't want to be habitual with my mind like that, not with the direction of my attention. You know, maybe I fondle this string as a habit. That's not the end of the world. But the moment that I see that, I don't want to do that, because I don't want to get into, who knows where that habit's going to lead. Before you know it, I'll be chewing on it, and then, then I'll have bad teeth or something like that, because I chew on everything. So one habit leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. They build on each other. So the idea of non-interference is that there's one thing that we're doing that is interfering with everything. And it's the direction of our attention towards thought that is taking us away from the moment. That interferes with everything. Our body gets tense, our mind gets tense, and it's that tension over time, inflammation, and everything else that leads to sickness. Our energy doesn't flow smoothly. We have a million ideas and we don't know which one of them are good. We don't even know. Like, we've just come up with some shit. And so the idea of non-interference is that in the Qigong practice, it's not going to be result oriented, if that makes sense. So when it comes time to change behavior, behavior will be directly proportional to personal power and the commitment to the practice. But it's not necessarily focusing on an individual behavior and saying, I want to change that. That's a form of interference, because where is that coming from? It's coming from a thought bubble. We just created a thought bubble inside our mind, and now that is what's directing our practice. No, no, no. If behavior is going to change, it's going to be because, one, you're feeling the moment so sensitively, so acutely, that the habits that you've been doing for so long no longer are feeling good. And eventually the mind will be like, feel good, bad, don't want. Sometimes when I talk about the mind, I talk in a caveman voice. That's a little bit old school. But my caveman voice is the basic mind. Yeah. So bad, good. That's the way our mind is. So eventually, I'm about to go in for this third piece of cake, and my mind is like, bad. You'll feel no good. Don't do it. And then I'll use my practice, I'll redirect, and I'll show how to do that later when we get into what I call hunting power. But it will be a derivative of our overall personal power. So ultimately, what we're doing in this practice is using the rule of three to get out of our own way. And that is non-interference. Some people, when I say non-interference, they look at it as a form of passivity. Oh no, I'm not going to let somebody punch me in the face. That's passivity. That's non-action. So that's not what I mean at all. Non-interference doesn't mean non-action. It means that you're getting out of the way, allowing creativity to flow, action to flow, potential to flow, evolution to potentially flow, beneficial change over time. Does that make sense? So when I say non-interference, that is a fundamental principle of this practice. I'm not looking to change deliberately any specific thing. I'm not looking necessarily to focus on specific problems or things that I need to change, or even things that I want necessarily. Does that make sense?
That does, and even your example makes me laugh, because I have some brownies in the house, and this morning I looked at the brownies, was like, oh, heavy. And I saw fresh fruit. It's like, ah, yes, fruity and light.
Mm-hmm. That's your gut brain connection. They're having a conversation about what sounds good to eat. So the idea is that we have a flow of energy that we're born with. And one of the differences between this practice and other practices, and it's very common in other practices because it's a habit. One of the fundamental habits of the human condition is to attempt to manipulate and control to get to a desire. So when you see desire, intention, and will, especially for men and the male mind, the desire is below the level of active recognition, and so sometimes is the intention. They don't really, it's not an active thing. It's not, well, my intention is to subtly manipulate this woman so that she'll sleep with me. No, that's not going through their mind. They're just doing their thing, they're trying to be jazzy or whatever, but there's a desire, intention, and a will dynamic that's occurring below active recognition because the mind is extremely habitual. It's not in balance between habit and active volition and choice, deliberateness that we bring in to the experience using our practice. Does that make sense?
That's helpful. I'm glad you brought that up exactly the way you did.
Yes, William.
I have a question. What's another term, or how do you call the rule of the repetitive practice of the rule of three? Does it become, what I'm trying to say is, is it a habit? It becomes, I know that, so it's like, I'm creating a habit of returning using the rule of three, but it's not habitual in the sense of of other habits. You know, I'm trying to say,
Yeah.
what's another word for the return to your practice regularly that's not a habit? Because you're creating a way of returning to the moment, and it becomes like the more I'm practicing, the more when I realize that I'm down the road with my thoughts, then I bring myself back, and it's becoming.
We usually just say back to the practice, which means you are above the threshold of recognition. You're choosing your points of attention. So back to the practice wherever your practice is at the moment. That's what we say, right? I mean, I don't think we have another phrase for it.
I get that. I just was wondering if there was, or how do we determine? Because the word habit, generally, I guess,
right. That's why we
implies,
call it a practice. It's not establishing a new habit. It's not replacing an old habit with a new one. It's practicing something actively in the moment.
And for devil's advocate, let's say that we do start to create the habit of redirection. The reason that redirection itself can't have the strength and momentum of a habit that has gained strength and momentum is because of the deliberate points of attention are not habit.
yes,
Right. So because so the rule of three is always to go back to your deliberate points of attention and then at least maintain one of those as you kind of go back to what you were doing throughout the day. It's those points of attention, especially ones like breath. Breath can never become habit because of the way that the body is hardwired. If you're aware of your breathing, that will always be a deliberate act. So we always have at least something like breath. So if we do, and I think that could be a discussion that we could have, is whether the act of recognition and redirection does start to become a sort of habit. I think if it does, it won't have momentum and strength because of how the redirection technique works itself. It comes back to the moment, uses non-habitual points of attention. So there's so much non-habit involved in the rule of three that even if the rule of three started to become somewhat habitual, it won't gain the strength and momentum of habit that is below the threshold of recognition because it includes all of our active points of attention. That's kind of the mechanism that will prevent that. Yes, William.
I think I like how you just said that below the threshold of recognition. I think that makes the distinction another clarity that the other habits that we're talking about primarily are things that are not within the threshold of recognition. So it's like the habitual thought of other things that you don't even know you did that. All of a sudden you like, oh, I'm here again. I didn't even realize I got here. That's quite different than bringing yourself back to the present moment through the rule of three. And that may become like I was training the other day. I was at the gym and I just was I was going through some exercise, but I realized that people walking around had distracted my mind. It was a lot going on. And I was like, man, I haven't actually brought myself, I was aware that I hadn't done the rule of three and I don't know how long, but I was like, all right, so it was like but So and I've noticed it come up at other times, and I'm like, okay, I'm becoming much more aware of when I am directing back and when I'm not. But it's still, the concept is that that's deliberate. It is not just some habitual pattern where other times I'll be washing dishes and I'll be making up a story in my mind. I'll be having a whole conversation like, wait, how has this story been going on? I'm like creating characters and all kind of stuff in my mind. Like, how long has this been happening? Anyway.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, and again, so we're not trying to eliminate all habit. That's going from one extreme to another, and it's also working against the natural dynamics of the human brain. But we can bring everything to the light of active recognition. And that's kind of what we're doing in this practice. Have you ever watched TV and you see a commercial that you've seen? You know that commercial has happened 100 times since you've been watching TV, but it was like the first time you ever saw it because you actually paid attention to it. Or you see a new element of it because you weren't really paying attention, or you look over at somebody and like, did you just see that? And they're like, see what? And it's like, well, you're looking at the TV, like your eyes are on the TV. What the hell is going on in your mind if not the TV? They're below, even though they're watching TV in the moment, they're below the threshold of active recognition. And one of the things that we really work with is something that I call the deliberate nature. The deliberate nature of our cognition is above the threshold of active recognition, and it has a feeling. And that could also be what you're noticing, William, as the more that you do the practice, is that there's a different feeling between the mind going in a habitual implosion type of process and a mind that is choosing its direction, that has a completely different feeling. And eventually we can just distinguish that feeling as going towards or away from the practice. And then that alone can be your cue to rule of 3 when you feel that you're going away from the practice. Okay, so we have basic alignment, which doesn't really interact with thought too much. In Qigong, the first 2 principles of being present and deliberately intending your points of attention in advance are woven together. So you do that on day 1 in the Qigong practice for basic alignment. I haven't written counterbalance yet, but it's going to be fun. It's not going to be as fun as hydrostasy. That's really fun. But the counterbalance phase is the rule of 3. That's pretty much it. That's pretty much what we're dealing with primarily. I'll start to introduce very basic formal practices because we're looking for non-interference. We're just looking to get out of our own way, get back to movement, allow things to flow better. And there are some formal practices that can help that occur. Does that make sense? And one of the reasons that this is always non-interference is because there is no subject and object with human attention. You are it. It doesn't age. It doesn't change perceptively. Our attention is always our attention. From the day that we were born until we transition to something new, that transition is identical throughout our entire life. And so there is no subject. I can't control it. I am it. So it comes down to, why did that single-celled organism choose to move in the first place? Intelligence. Does that make sense? That can be a little bit tricky because I went back to the very foundations of all life on Earth, the single-celled organism deciding to move. But
I was just going to say that the rule of 3, I think I forgot to do this a lot of times, and I didn't recognize the importance of it, is to choose an internal point of attention and an external point of attention, along with my voice of power. It's like a tripod, it really establishes a frame of balance that is that you can feel. And if you're constantly picking points of attention outside of yourself and nothing is an internal point of attention, we can easily slip into, when we're coasting or when we're forgetting, becoming reactionary and relying on external, and then weighing the pros and cons of all the external things. And so once I remember still, to choose an internal point of attention, which is my breath or whatever. My Dantian, that was the last one I agreed to. I know it was the first one you suggested, but the last thing I wanted to do is put attention on my belly. And the voice of power, which is some kind of knowing. It always had to be some sentence of knowing that resonated with me, some quote or whatever. And that well-being exists. Like, I'm not searching for anything. I'm not striving for anything. All is well is a fact. I have to remember all is well, and I'm choosing a balance within that. And that the rule of three doesn't just bring you back to the present. It's a balancing effect. My desire to do the practice, I had a lot of practices before coming here. My desire to do it is because I realized that my tendency was to worry, problem solve, worry. They went together. And thought streams were always about that. Usually about other people, but often about myself. Worry, I'm concerned about, I have to fix everything before I can feel peace. And I recognize that wasn't true. And it also wasn't productive, because I felt like I've lost myself in this world of worry and thinking and problem solving. And then where am I existing in that? And a lot of the things that you talked about in the beginning, people had different reasons, social anxiety or weight loss, or, they have all kinds of goals. But you spoke about that there were 1440 minutes in a day. And I still bring up the 1440 because I felt very strong-minded individual. I felt like I was relatively bright and that I had good control over my life. And yet I was a victim of my thoughts. And how do I want to spend the 1440 minutes in my day? Because they're, I know time is relative, but still I have a finite amount of time on the planet, and I've been blessed with the ability to reflect on these things and to have choice. And I have an infinite amount of choice compared to most people on the planet. And how am I spending that 1440 in any other way than deliberately appreciative is blasphemous. It's wasteful. It's all within my control. So every time I would get frustrated with, this is going to take forever because I'm forgetting so much more often than I'm remembering, that concept of, I have 1440 minutes. What did I just do with the last 15? I was below the threshold of recognition, and I don't want to exist below the threshold of recognition. I love my life. I would like to honor my life, and I would like to be present for it. So that was one of the things that kept me going. But in the rule of three, I found that my mind was not balanced, and that having an internal point of attention and an external point of attention, along with my voice of power. And there were lots of things we discussed in class that had resonance for me, and I scribbled them down in a bunch of places. So my mantra for the day would be different, but mostly all is well was the one that resonates with me, because I have an understanding of that concept. At this point, I've acquired pretty much enough data to recognize that I can I can have mastery over my own mind and be adaptable to most situations. And if I don't, I have a really good support system. So I don't have to worry about all that stuff. I just have to do this. So just do it. Notice when you're not doing it, go back to doing it.
Mhm.
So but yeah, I wanted to bring that up about the rule of three, because we weren't talking about that so much.
Yeah.
That internal and external. and voice of power provided a really tripod is all I could think of. You know, the three legs. It was a stable balance to exist within.
Yep. And then, but remember, so with the first Qigong book, I introduced the 4 directions of attention. Eventually you can embody all 4 directions simultaneously, but the 4 directions are internal, introspective, sensory perception, extrospective or regular sensory attention of the outside world, a form of cognition, which in Donna's case was the voice of power. It could also be imagination. There are other things that we can do with our mind. And then breath. So that's the 4 directions of attention that couldn't never really become habit. Okay, so those are the first 2 layers of the practice. The first layer doesn't really have a lot of rule of 3, but the second layer of counterbalance does, because we're learning to maintain a point of emphasis, one of your 4 directions of attention at all times. Does that make sense? That does sound heavy for some people, because I've heard them express the heaviness of it before, is that the idea of maintaining a point of attention all day sounds impossible, or it sounds too lofty. Well, wait till I start talking about differential rotation and multiple points of attention simultaneously all throughout the day. Then it's really going to seem insurmountable until you start to do it, and then you realize, actually, I think this is possible. This is something I could do. So we get into warrior training, and I'm going to save this whiteboard, even though it doesn't have that much on it. But warrior training is true to that word warrior. In order to even attempt warrior training, a person has to have the unbending desire to feel peace, to be in that center of their hydrostasy bubble, using the practice and the rule of 3. Here's what happens in our life. We have this thing that we call the lens of perception. So the way that the lens of perception really looks, I'm going to put little dark circles inside of the lens of perception. This is what we think about ourselves, because we're thinking about ourselves all the fucking time. Like, we're thinking about what I want for dinner. Is this right for me? Am I going to get what I want? You know, what's working out? What's not working out? What's my worry? How am I going to control, manipulate? You know, what's going well? What's not going well? It's all still thought about the self. Does that make sense? So we're thinking about ourselves all the time. Would you say that it's fair to say that each of us has a self-image, how we view ourselves, that exists? Jerry views herself a certain way. Karen views herself a certain way. Karen's. I view myself a certain way. Sort of. So we all have a way of viewing ourselves. Where does that come from? It comes from thinking about yourself. Have you ever met somebody who they think about themselves and they really think some cool shit, but maybe the rest of the world doesn't really agree with them? They don't really see it that way. And I'm not saying that's good or bad or plus or minus, or we should value what other. I'm just saying that the way that I'm describing the lens of perception doesn't really include what other people think, not necessarily. It can include what we think about what other people think, and that's thinking about what other people are thinking about and how they're judging us and how they're viewing us. But how often are we simply just using our own mind, thinking about ourselves, images of ourselves, and we're creating this image, the self-image, the self-reflection? Does that make sense? Now, what happens when we create this self-image is it affects everything. This is almost a tryptophobia, the irrational phobia or fear of circles.
You drew your own
I did.
your own battleground.
I don't like it. So everything going in, and this is our basic dynamic, input, output. Is going through the lens of perception that has all of these imaginary circles of ourselves, of how we view ourselves, our goals, our desires, you know, our purpose. Oh, that's a fun one. That's one of the biggest ones that people of antiquity have always gotten themselves muddled over. What is my purpose here on earth? And then before you know it, we have all these ideas of before and after the physical existence. Well, we chose to come to earth. It's a part of our higher purpose to be divine creatures of the infinite fifth dimension. Maybe. I put that on the island of I don't know. It sounds like it could maybe not be a thing. I don't know, but shit.
Don't those thoughts get in the way of being authentic in the moment?
Well, it can. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And the way that I would define the word authenticity is a lens of perception that is clear from all of this. There's only one way to cleanse the lens of perception, is to stop thinking about yourself all the time. What do we think about? We compare and contrast. We think about our likes and our dislikes. We think about our wants. We think about our desires. We think about what other people are thinking about in reference to us and our wants and our desires. And so we get into what we call the traps of thinking. And that's the biggest aspect. And so the first three traps of thinking are in counterbalance: repetitive, habitual, and not making me feel well. But then we really go into the traps of thinking in warrior training. And what do we do with those? We redirect them using the rule of three. And I don't know a lot of people who have been fully committed to the warrior training to yield its result of cleansing this imaginary lens of perception that we have of ourselves. And then what happens is people start to act this out. They act out their lens of perception that is just full of self-image. And that's what the reflection is. That's where the self-importance comes from. Does that make sense?
Oh, yes, I'm glad you brought that up because I've noticed with myself, I'll feel in the moment to say something, but then I might reflect back for a moment and go, oh, how would that look? Like that thought pops up, and then I put that aside, come back to the practice, and then it flows freely.
Mhm.
So I really can relate.
Incidentally, in our triangles, this is the only way to get intelligence and desire closer together, is to clear your lens of perception. Yes, William.
Just a little side thought. I was having a conversation with a friend yesterday, and I have another friend who always says, when you ask him how's he doing, I'm blessed and highly favored. And I was like, I made a joke that, so what about me? What am I over here, like dead lunch meat? And they're like, it's not nobody could get my point that I was saying. And I now it's like, we're so it's a good thing to say that to recognize you're blessed or that you have good things happening in your life. But then to say I'm highly favored, it's just like, really, like, why are you so special? It's like that whole lens of perception. And I know that they don't mean it in that way, but essentially it's all about me and I have the hardest time explaining why. And I got stuck with somebody in a little debate about that, like that I'm making too big about the highly favored part. And it's a hard thing to describe why, but that's really, it's like everything is about your lens of perception being about you, and that, and so you could just say, I'm blessed and grateful, but then to say I'm highly favored, it's like, I know you're the chosen people, you're the, everybody has this thing where they're either somehow have a special connection to everything else, it's just, anyway, that whole lens of perception is very much built into people's dialogue and their self-image of themselves.
I love what you said about special, because I notice a lot of parents telling the kids, you're so special, you're special. And it's like, oh my.
Right.
And like William said, though, there can be a balance where telling yourself that you're special can be a booster, right? It can but the way that we talk to ourselves over time becomes something else. And then before you know it, they don't realize to say that one is highly favored must mean that somebody else is not as favored by definition. Unless everybody is highly favored. And if everybody's highly favored, then we don't need to talk about it. Right. Because then it wouldn't exist, because there would be no context.
Yeah, but they asked how he was doing, so that's what he chose to say.
And I get it. So not declaring.
It reminds me how highly favored I am when someone says that. like, oh yeah, thanks for reminding me.
Yeah.
My,
Yeah.
yeah, we all are. Yeah.
I mean, that's perception and but that's the other person's statement. We're all lying, and I get that. I get that.
I
But
know you do.
yeah,
And it
but it's
doesn't matter whether they do or not.
right. But it is this, and I'm just tying it back to the idea that we have these self-image conversations that we have, and it can be healthy. And I think in general that is, and that's what it does. It reminds you you're highly favored. That's how it's supposed to be. And somebody may say I'm picking, I'm splitting hairs over it. But to me, I think it just triggers that thought that it's just funny that that's how we talk to ourselves, and it's okay. I mean, no big deal.
Yeah, I know what you mean though. Yeah.
It's definitely an example of what Ernest is talking about. It was a good example.
Yeah, it's a perfect example. And yeah, it is creating self and other, because the othering, the tendency to focus on other people will always trace back to the tendency to focus on oneself. And that's how, this is just an observation, but when I walk down the street and I hear conversations occurring around me because I'm listening behind me, I can't help but notice that the vast majority of the conversations that people are having are about people that aren't there. They're talking about the people at work, or they're talking about what Joe Blow did in line at the grocery store, and they had the audacity to so-and-so's dating so-and-so. So the reflection is now what we call othering. And that's creating now a perception of another person that's still what? Going through the lens of your own mind. It's your own self-reflection. And a lot of times when people say that your judgment of another person is a reflection of yourself, they don't understand what we're talking about. That's what we mean. Does that make sense? So the rule of three in relationship to the warrior training is we start to redirect any time that we notice that we're going down these rabbit holes. And eventually the end of the warrior training, we redirect any thought about ourselves, because you don't need to. There's no thought about yours. And if you have this, oh my God, that's the thought. It's the thought of all thoughts that bring all thoughts together. And I just feel so magical about this thought. Write that shit down. Let it come back to you. Because if you allow it to become another roaring river, you're going to get taken off with it. And I call that sensationalizing. And it's completely unnecessary. It's disadvantageous to the practice. I noticed this I've noticed this all throughout, the time that I've been doing this, but at the movie theater, when people would go to a party or they would dabble with hallucinogens or different things, they would come back and just talk about it and talk about it and talk about it. And I'm like, guys, what else can we say about this that we haven't already said? Like, it's not leading to anything, other than more spots on the lens of perception.
One thing I also like that you said, reminded, it's okay to feel sensational. It's another to start talking about it. So I like that you added that last time.
And even if a thought does come, that's, again, we're a balanced principle. So a thought about how sensational things feel isn't the end of the world, but that could be a potential stream that takes you away from the moment and the sensational feeling. And now, before you know it, you've created a whole other type of thing. So warrior training is designed for the individual who has the unbending desire to feel peace. And we start to redirect any thought about yourself, which will also lead to any thought about another person. I don't need to do that. Well, how does that benefit me? How many hours of my 1,440 minutes am I just thinking about Ernest or thinking about other people in relation to Ernest? It doesn't make sense. It's a form of dysfunction. It's psychological dysfunction as a result of unconscious or below the threshold of active recognition momentum of the human mind. And now what happens, though, is the more that we redirect thoughts about ourselves, well, there's nothing anymore, or there's, over time, it does take time, but there's nothing sustaining these bubbles. There's nothing really sustaining or creating these little blips in our bubble of perception, because what created them in the first place? Our thought about ourselves, the way we view ourselves. And if that's not occurring, it gets clear. Does that make sense? And then before you know it, things like intelligence and desire are almost overlapping. And you can see so many things that we're doing in our experience that are just not beneficial.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense.
So clearing the lens of perception isn't we're not looking to clear the lens of perception. We're not looking to get rid of habitual repetitive thinking. We're not looking to dissolve old habits. What we're looking to do is practice in the now moment presence with a variety of these techniques. And
It comes naturally.
and
as
as a result,
Mhm.
the lens clears. The habits, the thoughts, the words, the patterns, and the associated problem solving, anxiety, othering, all the things that we discover that we do, fades in our lack of attention on it. If we're not feeding it, they don't exist anymore. We can't help but notice that there is less of it and less of it and less of it in hindsight of our practice when we stop to reflect and look back. But if we focus on all of those things, it's important to identify them, because sometimes it's an aha moment to go, oh, I didn't even realize I was doing that every time, someone, whatever. But noticing it doesn't change it. Noticing it is just noticing it. The answer is always back to the practice. Where are my points of attention? Did I choose them in advance? Where's my breath? Here's my feet on the floor. That's what you do. You can go, oh, look at that, what I just did again. Or how long has it been and I have not been, like William said, I'm washing the dishes and I got a whole story going on. It's like, wow, I had new characters in there and I had the whole dialogue. Look what I had going on. And you know what? It might make a good movie or a short story or something to tell in class. But I can't tell you, William, how many times in class I would say to Ernest, oh, and I would have this thing and he'd say, go ahead. And then I'd say, I have this idea. And he's like, write it down. And then he'd go back to, oh, good, write that down. Maybe we'll discuss it at the end of class. Yeah, just write it down and go back to the practice. Really, there's no point in, and it's great to realize things because sometimes it becomes a touchstone or a new place to bounce off of so that we don't fall back into a repetitive habitual pattern. It breaks it up somehow. By having some new realization of what we were doing mindlessly before. But spending an awful lot of time talking about it has no inherent value.
And yep.
Let's go back to the practice. Yeah.
And so the idea is cleaning the lens of perception allows us to, and I'm putting this in air quotes so it doesn't get too mystical, but see. I can't help but use the word see because we talk about perspective. We talk about seeing things different, feeling things different. So the idea of seeing really does make a lot of sense and it fits.
Oh, sure. I just meant we don't really clean the lens. We practice and the lens becomes cleaner.
That's non-interference, doing without doing. When we, the Taoist philosophy, they love to talk in circles. And then it's like, if we don't have a frame of reference, we don't really know. It's like doing, not doing. How do I do, not do, not do? And then we have way, woo. And it's like, what the hell are we talking about? But this is it. So the non-interference is all we're doing is getting out of our own way through the thinking, and then everything starts to flow by itself. And then we're cleaning our lens of perception without trying to clean the lens of perception. We're coming to a more clear vision or view of the world. I don't use reality or, absolute, like you're seeing everything. I don't even like the word heightened. Heightened perception. It's like, okay, because that's like what William is talking about. The moment that we have heightened perception, well, sorry for you little folks who have unheightened perception. Don't want to be where you are. I can't get down with any of that. That's why we have layers to the practice, because this is actually, this class is me showing the layers of the practice with the rule of 3. And I'm about to do that with hydrostasy next, because the rule of 3 is a part of the entire practice. The techniques build I'll always be doing those beginning techniques, shadows, reflections, internal points of attention, breath, different types of breath. I'll always be doing it. So it builds on each other. One thing that I would say, though, is that when the lens of perception is clear, we do see things. So for example, I had this image of myself, and then I got a massage, and I realized how squishy and soft I've become. I am squishy and soft, and everything hurts me. So I used to have this image of myself that I'm a, because I used to get in a lot of fights and I used to get beat up a lot. So, you can get beat up so many times and you can start to take hits, you can start to take pain. And before you know it, something that used to really shatter your world is like getting kind of used to that. That's not so bad, right? That's gone. That's long gone. Any type of anything just makes me feel like I got a massage and I felt like somebody gently rolled me down a hill 150 times. So I was sore all over, but not that bad, if that makes sense.
I can relate, Ernest.
Yeah. But the idea here is I had that view of myself. I could see it more clearly. It's like, Ernest, let's just take a step down the ladder here, buddy, because you're not a hot shot. Like, you're not a big, tough guy. You're squishy and you're soft and you're supple, and that's okay. It is what it is right now. When the world goes into a zombie apocalypse, I got to harden up a little bit because stuff could start to get a little tough, but it is what it is for now. But that's what I mean. So the lens of perception, sometimes things are revealed to you, you see it, it will come through as a thought because the mind likes to organize using words. And it's like, oh, okay, I've been projecting this image of, and not really projecting it to other people as much. It's not like I go and just second I see William Miller, I talk about how tough I am. But sometimes in my own mind, I view myself a certain way, and that's not necessarily cohesive with actuality, I'll say. Yes, William.
And not to get into a whole thing about how people view themselves, but I have realized in my own self and in listening to other people that sometimes the way you view yourself can be so hidden from you in a way that you don't realize that some of the decisions that you're making or that's where that's stemming from. And then you realize that you made some poor decisions based on a idea you have, or you can't accept certain things in your life because of an idea that you have in your life. So and so then it's just this idea about your self-image. And it's like you said, I think sometimes it's through your practice, or sometimes you come to like you got a massage, but something brings you to awareness of it, that you have a particular image of yourself. And then maybe something simple and light like that, or it could be something more deeper that's kind of interfering with you. And I listen to people. It's obvious when people age that they struggle with this because you're aging and you've had a self-image of yourself in a certain way, and then you get to a certain place in life and you have to adjust your self-image to where you're at in that place in life. But I think that sometimes you never really are consciously aware of it. So then you have a lot of challenges that you create because of this self-image, and you never clearly see why you're reacting this way.
I love that you brought that up because, as I get older, there was a time I was so down about it, but right now I don't feel down about it at all. And somebody even said to me on Zoom, they were like, wow, I've seen you before in the past and you looked old. Not that I'm saying you're old. And I'm like, sure you're not. But before, and then he said, you look so much younger and vibrant. But before, I know I would take that hurtfully as an insult, and I just found it very light. And I mean, I know I'm getting older, so it's not like I'm hiding that from myself.
Mm-hmm.
But I just thought it was funny how he backed off not to hurt my feelings. And there probably in the past, there would have been a time that it got me, but it just doesn't. I don't know. I feel young at heart. I know I'm getting older.
Yeah. And then, so, with Karen and William, what basically they're pointing out is that the lens of perception, when we have those dark circles of how we view ourselves, because we're talking about it, we're viewing it that way, thinking about it that way, excuse me, and also othering, that's the same thing. It leads back to ourself. That will have a derivative on our actions, on our behavior, on the things that we do. 100%. The lens of perception is the primary thing that is dictating all of our actions in the world. Everything that we do is being dictated by this lens of perception. So eventually we start to redirect any thought about self and other. That also includes, before we get to that point, comparing, contrasting, trying to figure it out, even imaginary scenarios. That's what William was doing while he was washing the dishes. And I used to do that. I would get myself into these imaginary what if scenarios. And then before you know it, I'm like, you know, beating everybody up in the restaurant that's getting on my nerves. And I'm imagining myself as something that I'm not. You know, like I'm not going to be, first of all, it's a barbecue restaurant and everybody, you know, is much bigger than I am. And yeah, they're being annoying and they're, you know, they're 25 people all have separate checks and like they easily could put it together because it's a work expense. And yeah, I really want to tackle these people, but that's all the imaginary scenarios that we start to run into our mind. And where is that imaginary scenario? It's an implosion. It's a little bubble inside of our mind that we're putting our attention into. The mind is constantly imploding when we're looking at electronics, when we're looking, even sometimes, and this can still be deliberate that we do this because we balance. So when I read, when I watch TV, I have my practice in place. So I am creating the little bubble inside, but I'm also still establishing outside so I don't lose my full connection. Does that make sense? So it's a balancing act. Okay, so moving right along, we are warrior training. We have cleansed our lens of perception, things going in, things going out. There was a time, and you guys have seen this if you've been with me long enough, that my personal power, and we'll get to the enemies of knowledge, was my enemy. I was doing a lot of intention and will. I had a lot of energy going. I had 20 private students. That's $100 per student, $2,000 a month, plus book sales, plus magazine sales, plus this sales, plus that sales. Money was coming in. I had people all over the place. I was traveling, and it was all, not all of it, because this was a maturation process for myself as well, but my lens of perception wasn't clean. So a lot of the things that were going in and going out were things that I won't do right now. I will have nothing to do with it. Does that make sense? Also because I take responsibility for my own actions in the way that I share this practice. So
Yes,
I
that
can't
makes a
do it a
lot of,
certain way.
that makes a lot of sense. That came into my thoughts, just what you described. I need not say anymore.
It's okay. Yeah, so the idea is that at a certain point, my own personal power, because my lens of perception wasn't clear, we could call that the Donald Trump effect, if we want to. The lens of perception is not clear, homie. Like, I'm just letting you know right now, you got a lot of self-indulgence going on. But there's areas of personal power through intention and will. That's a dynamic, that's a principle. If you have intention and will, desire is there in that triangle, you're going to generate personal power, at least in that area. And so you can do really great things in that area. But take yourself out of that area. They were talking about a hockey player who I won't mention, Hall of Fame hockey player, you know, Stanley Cup championships, everybody knows him, 16 seasons. And basically the city and the team are disowning him. Turns out he's a closet racist. And a lot of his racist comments came out, his racist statements came out. So the idea is, yeah, he had a lot of personal power on the ice in hockey because there was practice, there was momentum. There's probably an area where you could really focus and there wasn't a lot of outside chatter. But it wasn't going through a clean lens of perception. And so personal power can actually become an enemy of knowledge. You stop learning because you're so self-inflated. Does that make sense? Okay, so we're going to move on in the practice to hydrostasy, and we're going to assume that our lens of perception, and I don't want to say, I don't like the idea of absolutism, so I'm not going to say that that lens is ever perfectly clear. Maybe it's born, we're born, and even not born because we have DNA, we have memory. We have predispositions towards alcoholism. I was born with that. I have an L6, so I have an extra vertebra. I don't know if that's interfering, but I use that as an excuse for a lot of things. So I'm not saying that the lens is perfectly clear, but when we move on to hydrostasy, one thing is happening for sure. We are maintaining at least one point of attention at all times. That is a requirement for the hydrostasy practice. If that isn't there, it is not time to start. We're not going to get into hunting power, behavioral change, formal practice, certain formal practices, until a person is cleansing their lens of perception by doing this practice. Does that make sense?
So what is this topic?
We're still going to talk about the rule of three in relation to hydrostasy.
Okay.
Yep. So I talked about the rule of three in relation to basic alignment. It doesn't really exist. We're not really counterbalancing yet. And I also wanted a section of training that didn't interact with people's thought, because some people aren't ready for that yet. Remember Gene when he would say that he's used to relying on thought. So they're still identifying with thought as who they are. And if that identification is very strong, the rule of three is not going to be desirable. They're not going to look at that as something they need to do. However, coming back to the present moment more, we see more, we feel more, we're interacting with the moment more, we start to use our rule of three and counterbalance. I call it counterbalance because we'll lose our balance and we bring it back using the rule of three, which is at least 3 points of attention, using our voice of power to go back to at least 1 point of attention. So we use extra points of attention to get us back to 1. Does that make sense? And then we do that again in warrior training, because warrior training is an all-out commitment to this practice. Counterbalance, it can be dabbled. You know, I would recommend as much of it as possible, but a person could still really benefit from counterbalance when things aren't going well for them, when they're about to go into a business meeting, when they're about to, perform in some way, and they really want to center themselves, root themselves, they could counterbalance using the rule of three. But that's not what we're doing in warrior training. In warrior training, we have an all-out commitment to the practice because we want to cleanse our lens of perception, but that's not a focus of our desire. Just like we want to dissolve the destroyers, but we dissolve the destroyers by not focusing on the destroyers. We can highlight them, like Donna said, that it's occurring, and then we go back to the practice. But I'll talk about that more in hydrostasy. So where does the rule of three come up in the hydrostasy practice? Something that I'm creating for you in the Qigong practice is deliberate modulation and sensing energy. In the very beginning of the practice, we focus on the moment. Why? Because we care about it. Wouldn't you agree that that's the reason that we're focusing on the present moment? Because we care about our lives. We care about when it's happening. So we're using the equation that I have affectionately borrowed from Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, is that focus plus care equals quality. And that's a whole book on the concept of quality. So I'm not going to reinvent that wheel. Go read that book. It's a difficult book for some if you're not used to reading, because it can be a bit, it's not like yummy descriptive writing sometimes. It can be very, there's a lot of words I had to look up reading that book, I'll just say that. But it comes down to the basic focus plus care equals quality, and that the art isn't in what we do always, but how we do it. Does that make sense? Well, we started creating that from day one. Wouldn't you agree that we start to focus on the moment because we care about it? And so without trying, without highlighting it, we start to create quality. That is sensing energy. We can start to sense, and I will start to use the word abstract. When I say the word abstract, that means that it can't necessarily be demonstrated to other people. There will be derivatives, such as you're feeling more peaceful, you're not getting angry, you're more calm in emergency situations. So you'll be able to see the derivative, the branches of the tree. But when I use the word abstract, other people can't necessarily see that you're doing it or interacting with it. Does that make sense? It's a very personal thing. So that quality in the present moment is a simple result of caring about it enough to focus on it. And that's what we're doing with our Qigong practice in the bridge. We start doing it from day one, but in hydrostasy, we can start to highlight it. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, I'm glad you're bringing this up.
And some other things that, and I'll just say that we start to do, and this will come out more in the Qigong practice, but appreciation, whoops, through death. Death as an advisor. I stole this from Don Juan and Carlos Castaneda, and I'll build tricks that we can do in the Qigong practice, especially in counterbalance, where we really start to focus on creating this baseline of appreciation. Does that make sense? And I'll do it using death as an advisor. The moment that we think about our transition to something new, all of a sudden your problems aren't that big anymore. And our impending transition to something new inspires us to embrace the moment even more and live even more vibrantly. Does that make sense? And I'll deliver this, especially in counterbalance and warrior training at Qigong. I'll give points of attention, mantras, things that you can do to reinforce the quality in the moment and appreciation of the moment. And one of the characteristics of this is it can be done even when you're physically suffering. Granted, it feels a little bit different, but when you're physically suffering, you can still appreciate the fact that you're alive, and you can feel an abstract quality in the moment, and you still feel shitty. So that's still there. Does that make sense?
Yes, but it also, I'm noticing, like, I've experienced pain, feeling shitty, but still being appreciative, it seems to lessen the pain. That's been my experience. Maybe not all the time.
And what you're lessening is you're not creating the psychological with the physical. That's what we're used to creating, is because we feel shitty, we start to think shitty, and now everything is shitty. So it's going to be less shitty because your mind isn't in that pattern.
I get it. Yes.
And then I'll just touch on one more just for the sake of the conversation. And the other one is contentment. So these are three things that we can start to focus on. And remember that in the hydrostasy practice, it's all about feeling, because we've already we're cleaning our lens of perception. We're thinking much less. We're really used to using our rule of three, so it's not an imposition. But we can actually start to redirect back to these qualities using the rule of three. When we feel that we're going away from appreciation, why would you do such a thing? You are alive. You have 1 trillion times 1 trillion synaptic connections, potential connections in your brain. We are an absolute marvel of biological brilliance. There's absolutely nothing about the present moment that we should be taking for granted. And this practice will help develop that, especially in counterbalance and warrior training. I'll really focus on this in warrior training in the Qigong books, which the first one's done, by the way. I'm just going to add a couple other things and see if something comes to me, and then I'll have an official release date. And I put it into a book format because that turned out to be easiest for me. Okay, now we have a couple other things. One, a peaceful mind. Whoops, I don't know why it does that when I start to type. We have created a peaceful mind through our practice because we are no longer at war with ourselves. You know, the post that William made, and, you know, when you post a quote or when you post a thought, lo and behold, people will swoop in and they'll just be like, well, here's my mind. And that's okay. You know, it's discourse. It's fine. People love to talk about the ancients and how we've forgotten what the ancients have created. But I would like to remind people that despite the ancients' understanding of peace, they never really achieved it on the outside, because they never really achieved it on a grand enough scale on the inside. So true, the ancients knew this, the ancients knew that, but all of recorded human history has war, suffering, psychological suffering, and the implosion of the human mind because of the incessant tendency and habit of overthinking and thinking about themselves. So I see this in practices. You see this in psychology, where people start to compete again. And now we have, the perfect system, and then we have the perfect psychological explanation for everything. It's like everybody is constantly trying to undermine one another and come up with the most grandiose solution to the human dilemma. And that's, again, just another pissing contest. So this practice will fundamentally create a peaceful mind. It will create a calm emotional state, or excuse me, balanced emotional state. And I'm being general with this third one, and it's not in any particular order. We talk about attitude, and I'll put that in air quote or in parentheses, mood, because we'll do something in the Qigong training called mood intending, where we start to intend our own underlining mood the moment we wake up. So it's not trying to change how you feel, it's establishing it in the first place. So there's no control. We're not trying to control and manipulate. We're just choosing again the choice that we have as human beings. Impeccable, I think it has 2 C's or 2 P's, but impeccable self-awareness. So these are the 4 guarantees that I make of the Qigong practice. Now there's more. I do believe that there's a lot more that will come from it, but these are 4 that we can focus on, that if they do not exist, we need to go back to the basics. We need to go back to our warrior training, go back to our counterbalance training. Where is our mind, and did we put it there? Because if we don't have a peaceful mind, chances are we're not going to be able to answer that question. Balanced emotional state, a calm attitude, which is the mood. We're creating a balanced mood. When I say balanced emotional state, I mean more of the obvious emotions, anger and jealousy and frustration, or even joy, excitement.
And love too, right?
I don't really use love as an emotion. There are an emotional derivative from the way that we use the word love.
Well, I was going to say that word can get mighty tricky,
It
actually.
is extremely tricky. It's just like the F-bomb. It means nothing because it means everything.
Exactly.
And this will also come out in our Qigong training, because we're paying attention to the present moment without labeling it, judging it, comparing it, and contrasting to it. And before you know it, we'll be able to connect to the moment without judgment and without desire and without needing anything from it. And then we start to get to this word that I call love. But I don't use that word a lot, just because it is definitely a word that people will have different meanings and different understandings. And
That's a good idea, I've learned.
And then before you know it, I love everybody and everything. And it's like, really? Because you haven't met everybody. So how do you know? And then it's just this generality, which is okay. I'm okay with generalities, but I'm not including that right now. So the idea in warrior training that leads to hydrostasy is that in the hydrostasy practice, we will redirect using the rule of 3, and your rule of 3 will have a little bit less of the voice, because you're getting so good at using your points of attention and deliberately modulating yourself back to different emotional states and moods and energetic states. And it's all still just getting out of your own way. So it's still just non-interference personified. But in the Qigong training, if I'm walking down the sidewalk and I don't feel appreciation, back to the practice. I must be going away from the practice. So I go back to appreciation. Now, that doesn't mean that I won't feel cold or I won't feel pain or, whatever I'm feeling, but I will feel it with appreciation. If I'm walking down the sidewalk on my way to work, if I'm sitting over there with Shayna in our bedroom / dining room / kitchen / area, and I'm not feeling quality in the present moment, back to my practice. I'm going to use the rule of 3 to go back to deliberate points of attention and make sure that my 4 directions of attention are established. Does that make sense? So we're starting to get more into different emotions, different moods. We could use the word vibration if we want to, different vibrations that we're producing. Vibration is still a bit weird to talk about. Like, I can talk about it, but yeah.
Might get another weird vibe on that.
Yeah. It is a way to talk, and I can talk that way, but there are other ways to talk that are a little bit more descriptive of what's actually occurring.
What's so weird about vibration? It's just the truth.
It is the truth. And the number 1 and the number 2 have an infinite amount of decimal points between it. But the reason we don't talk about those infinite decimal points is because it's not tangible, it's not useful, it's not relevant. So while vibration is a way to describe the human experience, the physical perception of our experience is so far removed from infinitesimal vibrations that it's not really, it's like that moon energy. Yeah, you know, the full moon is tugging on the planet, and Mars appears to be in retrograde.
It's kind of like love.
It's kind of like love. Exactly. We're just going to talk about things that are a little bit more tangible, if you will. Because if it's more tangible, we can remember it better and we can do it better. So if I'm telling somebody just find the high flying vibration, William's going to look at me like, what the fuck is he talking about? Like, how do I find the high flying, you know? Donna, in your practice today, please just redirect to 547 gigahertz of joy. That's what I want you to do. Again, that's not a terrible
You know
description.
what, we say back to the practice, and it has a whole lot of history behind it, and we know what it means, and it suffices for our discussion because of this group.
Sure.
So sometimes that's true of other things. Will it get distorted if we had 100,000 people here instead of just us? Probably it would,
Oh,
because
yeah.
the
Some weird
majority of
looks.
people in their mind are seeing things through their own lens of perception, and how it's based on themselves, which is everything we've already discussed as well. So yes, I appreciate very much that you have found more exacting ways, more descriptive ways that allow us to be more consistent, and that you are sensitive to the fact that that there's a cultural dialogue along with some of these spiritual practices that have watered down the meaning so that they mean nothing. And I get that. And so we stay away from that for the sake of communication. But you know, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's people that connect with certain terminologies, and it is consistent, and they do understand what it means, and it's not distorted. But yes, the high flying disc might mean nothing to you, just like go back to the practice means nothing to somebody else. So you don't have to declare war on it. It doesn't mean
no.
that's a bad term.
You know
It's
what came to my mind is with you teaching it, it makes a difference how you want
Yes.
to. That's the
Yeah.
that came into my mind the other day. That's why
absolutely
I
correct.
understand where you're coming from, because
Yes.
you're impeccably teaching it to be understood so you
Bingo.
can practice.
Exactly.
and
So
you're not responsible for me
I'm not.
misinterpreting how you teach it and my poor teaching it. If I chose to do that without your without you being a participant,
Mhm.
you wouldn't be responsible for my distortion of understanding.
Yeah, and it's a lot like the word quantum. What does the word quantum mean? It means quanta. What does quanta mean? It means so tiny that you can't interact with it physically that you know of. So rather than talking about the quantum mechanics of the vibrational mind, I'm going to talk about thought, words, because that's
Thank
more
you.
tangible. That's what we can actually work with. So to answer Jerry's question, there's nothing wrong with it if that's how you want to think about it. But I have a certain responsibility to teach this practice in a way that somebody can actually do it. And the more we talk about quantum, before you know it, we're using scientific measurement in a very unscientific way. And then before you know it, now we're using quantum entanglement and different gigahertz and different, And go do what you want to do. But that's not a part of the Qigong practice, not necessarily. I'll never present it that way. If you make 457 gigahertz your point of attention, maybe.
I wasn't going quite that far with it, Ernest. But when you just lightly mentioned it in the conversation, and you said, well, I don't know.
Yeah. And
It's okay to use it once in a while. All I'm saying.
sure. Yeah. I mean, it's just verbiage. It's just more ways to describe things. So the idea here is that now when we get into hydrostasy, and I've been sending Donna messages every now and then to describe setting up the hydrostasy practice. Number one, where are your 4 directions of attention, or do you even know? Are your 4 directions fundamentally connected with the 4 modes of the human being? Sitting, standing, moving, and laying down. If the answer is yes, and it's gaining momentum, you are creating space in the overall volume of thought, and that can be felt. I challenge a person to do this practice to the point where they can feel the mind is actually opening. It has more space. And then you can pay attention to that. When you pay attention to that space in the thoughts, that grows and it gains momentum, and it starts to lead to what I call the gates of seeing, or even further, you're clearing your lens of perception. Does that make sense? Even that itself can get a little woo-woo, but that's why I try to use my words and descriptions and pictures to make it more tangible, so that we're not just talking shit. We're talking about a thing that someone can do. Technique is what crosses the divide between theory and application, not philosophy. Okay, so we have the 4 directions of attention, and the 4 directions of attention combined with the 4 modes, that gains enough momentum that we start to create space in the overall amount of thought. And that space can be paid attention to. That can become your cognitive direction of attention, to where you're paying attention to the fact that your mind isn't thinking. Does that make sense? You can pay attention to that. You can see that space. You can feel it without words, because cognition includes more than just talking to ourselves. And as we do that, anytime that we start to go away from deliberate modulation, so that sets up what I call deliberate modulation. It is almost impossible to deliberately modulate the way that and I don't even like using the word modulate. I'm still using it though. But it is more emotional memory, in a manner of speaking. That's one way to talk about it. We set that up by clearing the mind. If you are in thought or counterbalancing thought, deliberate modulation is impossible. That's not really what you're doing. Does that make sense? So in order to change, or determine how you want to feel, mood intending, we first create space in the overall amount of thought by maintaining at least 1 point of attention, hopefully 4 simultaneously, because that will create enough space in the overall amount of cognition to establish. Otherwise, we're just changing. We're changing how we feel because our thought is creating an emotion, and now we want to change that. That's not what I'm talking about. That's a form of interference. We don't need to do that. We just need to get out of the way, let everything flow, and before you know it, we'll feel these feelings, such as their emotional, vibrational, electrochemical, physiological, and hormonal responses to what? Our engagement to the present moment without interference. That starts to feel like appreciation. That starts to feel like some of this expansion into the infinite, like you're exploring, you get this wondrous feeling, and you can start to sense the quality. Every artist knows what I'm talking about. When you're doing movement, you can start to sense the quality behind the physical. When you're painting a painting, you can sense the quality behind the physical. Does that make sense? And there's ways to do this. And of course, that's a part of the hydrostasy and the warrior training practice that I'll deliver in what I call Qigong. Mind, intention, exercise. I'll give exactly how to do this and ways to do this, and you'll either do it or you won't. And other people, as they pick up these books, and I'll combine them all eventually into Donna's compendium. And then we'll have a Igong compendium that's just one book that takes you from basic alignment to the hydrostasy, which I call the abstract principles, is the end of hydrostasy. Just principles to keep us interacting with the unknown.
I like what you said that rings in my ear. Get out of your own way.
That's all we're
very
doing.
helpful. Yes, I see that now. Yes.
And that's the foundation of non-interference, not trying to control, not trying to manipulate, but we're also not passive. We're not just letting things take us down old roads. It's
Not at all.
It's doing, not doing. We actually have a mechanism. We know we can do that.
That's the first time I've heard that explained where I can understand it, doing and not doing.
At the same time. Yep. Okay, so as we move through the hydrostasy practice, we have established our 4 modes with our 4 directions. We've created a lot of space. We engage that space. Eventually that will create an effect that I call dream walking. And in the middle of that is mood intending and deliberate modulation and sensing energy. Sensing energy is finding the abstract quality. Now, where does the rule of 3 come in? If I am going through my day, which I will, and I see myself going away from appreciation, right back to it. Contentment, which is Thich Nhat Hanh's definition of happiness. So when we feel content with the moment, we're not bored and we're not otherwise at odds with the moment. When that feeling occurs more and more, I call it dream walking, because your problems are gone, your weight is lifted, and now you're just doing your thing. You're living your life. You're creating. No plus, no minus. And then we'll get into the final core of the teaching, which is the active alignment, which is really adaptation. And I'll have a procedure for that, a way to check into, am I adapting to the present moment? Is this making me more adaptable or less adaptable? If a zombie apocalypse was to start tomorrow, am I going to have a higher survival rate or a lower survival rate? And I know that's an arbitrary thing, zombie apocalypse, but what happens when the power goes out? What happens when a tornado happens? What happens when space junk falls from the sky? Are we still able to maintain our practice and move, adapt? Because that is directly proportional to our ability to change over time. If we can't change over time, we die and we won't evolve. The mind won't continue to develop. Does that make sense?
Yes, I like the way you described it all too. The continuum.
And so the rule of 3 will have, outside of basic alignment, because we don't really do the rule of 3 yet, the next 3 phases or layers of the practice, they all have the rule of 3. So I'll be going throughout my day today. And if I'm sitting here typing on the computer, listening to a customer, and I don't sense quality in everything, I redirect back to my practice. Where are my points of attention? Where are my Igong points of attention? Do I see reflections? Do I see shadows? Do I see my bubble of perception, CV17, CV23? And I'm only using acupuncture points because Donna can look those up, Jerry can look those up, and then you'll know what I'm talking about.
Are you saying C, D,
CV, cardiovascular.
Oh.
So it's a channel in the body, CV. Mhm. And it's arbitrary. It's just a point of reference that, happens to work really well with what we're doing. CV6 is the Dantian, CV17 is the middle Dantian. We could do 20 or the, this doesn't have a point. It's like, it's a word, yuan something or another, but the third eye. And I talk my practice out. So I'm like back to my CV17, back to the present moment, back to feeling quality in the moment. And then, so let's say that I live for 30 more years and I'm doing hydrostasy practice for the next 30 years. I will have accumulated 30 more years of quality, of connection without judgment. We can call that what we want to, Karen, but that connection to the moment without judging and trying to control and trying to manipulate, that's not occurring. So I'm accumulating the momentum of appreciation. I'm creating the momentum of quality, abstract elements to the present moment. I'm creating momentum of appreciation for the opportunity to exist because I'm using death as my advisor. What else do I need? And then everything else just starts to come into better focus. What do you want to do for a career? What do you want to do for relationships? What do you want to do for dinner tonight? Those things all become much more clear because we have less of the cognitive resistance versus non-resistance. I would get so frustrated when people would talk about that in Tai Chi because I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? Non-resistance. Like, can you please just give me an example? And then they'll say, well, non-resistance is when you control your opponent. And I'm like, what? Like, now I'm using the word control with non-resistance. And it's like, do you even know what you're talking about? Because it makes no sense.
That's why I really feel content with the way you're explaining it and teaching it. It's helped me a lot because I've been through the same thing. What the hell are they talking about?
Yeah, me too. And then we do add physical practices. So we can go back to our physical practices also as a part of our rule of three. Because some of the physical practices are transient. They can go with you. I can sync the chi wherever I'm at. I can do that internal Dantian rotation wherever I'm at. And then there's other things, like there's other moods, but these are the ones that I've chosen to focus on that I believe are guarantees of the practice. And one aspect of these guarantees is they can be present with physical suffering. That's important. So if we fall and we break our leg, if we're doing our practice, we will find some kind of quality. Your leg will still hurt, but you won't be creating the psychological hurt along with the physical hurt. And now you have both hurts. And what does psychological hurt do? It makes everything worse. So we're at least eliminating the psychological hurt to a certain extent. But somebody near us and dear to us transitions to something new. We feel sadness. I'm not going to try to change sadness. That's interference. I'm not going to try to wish it away or, wish I was somewhere else, or all of that is a form of interference. Instead, I get out of the way and sadness will naturally change. And despite the fact that somebody I care about or something I care about has transitioned, I can still feel quality, this opportunity to exist, more appreciation. Doesn't that, like when someone transitions to something new, we can appreciate life even more because death as our advisor is even more poignant. Is that a word? Is even more a part of our present moment. It's even more
That's
sharp.
beautifully put, so beautifully put, because I can really relate to that after losing many people.
And that doesn't make things easy. That's what people in the world, that's a blotch on our lens of perception, is we want everything to be easy. We want everything, but then some people go to the opposite extreme and they want everything to be difficult, and it's like, that makes no sense.
It takes time.
When we're practicing, there's more space. So
Yes.
in that space, you can find you can find that you can be human and appreciate and have peace at the same time. You can grieve and have a sense of contentment. You can feel sad and still honor the relationship.
Yes.
Or you can feel things simultaneously. But not as another, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. The practice, I think, allows you the space to appreciate the quality of your own grief, even because you can appreciate all that at the same time. Bye, William.
Yep, that's exactly right. So the Igong, or I agree. I don't know if it's right or wrong, but I do agree with that statement. So the Igong practice, I'll have the first book ready. I was going to do I don't know, about a week or so, because I just really want to fine tune it. But this shit's a review for you guys. Like the Qigong practice should seem like baby stuff, because it's the very basics where I recommend putting your attention. It won't have plus or minus. It's not trying to change or trying to control. Karen got a little bit of the Qigong practice in a one-on-one. She's either doing it or she's not. You know, the next time that we talk, I'll say, well, tell me about the shadows, because paying attention to shadows helps to create the abstract quality. A shadow's there, but it's also not there. You see what I mean? Like it's there, but it's not there. So I actually am using points of attention that will set up the hydrostasy practice, and it will set up the warrior training practice, and it will set up the counterbalance practice. So each technique lends to something bigger and better and different. Bigger and better, that's weird. It adds to the practice so that we can get to this point where we're counterbalancing in our hydrostasy bubble. And micro adjustments, not macro adjustments. The counterbalance in the beginning, that layer of training, that's macro adjustments. But we'll be making micro adjustments all throughout the day. All right, does that make sense? And so rule of 3 for me as I go throughout the day, I will probably talk out my practice. I'll say there's CV17, you know, here's my body and space and time. There's the contentment. There's that contentment with creativity and just do energy. So contentment doesn't mean that you're stuck. It doesn't mean that you don't want to create, that you don't want to do anything anymore.
It doesn't mean you've arrived.
Absolutely.
You found it just like you found a point of attention.
Yes.
You don't arrive.
No. And that's why when I talk about the gates, I like describing them as a tunnel, an infinite tunnel that you just continuously walk through. And we continue to learn. We continue to add to the knowledge bank. Our mind, our energy, our spirit, our vibration will continue to evolve. And I guess William had kind of pointed on this, but one of the reasons I don't use vibration and things like that is because just like everything else, it's become higher or lower, better or worse, plus or minus. Now, before you know it, you're rejecting low vibrational people and you're only welcoming in high vibrational people. So you've basically just created a religious class system. The same thing that's in a religion or in a cult. I like being around all you high vibrational folks. And it's just another form of separation, and it gets a little bit derogatory. So I don't really talk about it quite that way, but yeah, Donna's right. In this group, we could talk about vibration in a certain way. But I would still recommend interacting with things that are more tangible. I won't go tell, you know, Karen or Jerry to go make their vibrational essence their point of attention. I'll say, have an object of power, have a note card, have reminders set up in your environment that remind you to practice. Because the Qigong practice will be a challenge, and it will help you determine whether you're really doing this or not. Because you can't hustle yourself. You're either doing the Qigong practice or you're not. All right, any questions, comments, or concerns before we head out? I think that is definitely a lot about.
Making my note card.
Excellent. I have my note cards. I could take pictures of them throughout the day. I have taken little objects from my house and I have littered them around the clinic. I don't know if Bob has noticed that there's a little porcelain turtle that is now next to the retail products. And then I have a little wooden elephant that's next to the printer, because those are reminders. I litter my environment with reminders to be present. Does that make sense? Those are objects of power. If I don't do it, I mean, what the hell am I talking about? Like, what am I sharing and teaching if I'm not doing it myself?
Yes, I'm glad you shared them though.
All right. Any questions, comments, or concerns? So Qigong practice, very basic. It starts with things like paying attention. It starts with your 4 modes, your outside points of attention, defocused vision, peripheral vision. That will help to build the bubble of perception. It's also really great when there's a lot of foot traffic. You can bob and weave and interact, listening behind you. You're either listening behind you or you're not. And if you are, you're also increasing your bubble of perception and your proprioception, and it's going to make you more safe in an environment, and you're less likely to have an accident because you're so connected to the world around you. But you're either listening behind you or you're not. You can hustle me, but you can't hustle yourself. So those are some of the examples. Tactile touch. I recommend having something on your skin or a way to interact with now that I let you do yourself, but you have to have something. So if I say, Donna, in your EGON practice, what are you doing for tactile touch? You either have an answer or you don't. Do you see what I mean? I will let you, there's certain ones that I will let you be a little bit more creative, but you either have established that point of attention or you have not. And if you have not, you're not doing your EGON practice, or you're at least not doing all of it. Maybe you're doing a little bit of it. And yeah. Oh, you muted yourself, Donna.
You don't mean your EGON practice in general. You mean at the moment.
That at that moment, you're not doing that.
Okay.
You're not doing that portion of it, at least. So if you intended to listen behind you today and you're not doing it, you're not doing it.
Oh, I'm just saying sometimes my tactile things depend on what I wear.
Yes.
Like I'm wearing my sweatpants that have the fuzzy inside right now. So I'm aware of the fuzzy inside of my sweatpants. That's my tactile thing.
Do you want to know a secret? One of
What?
mine. So because in hydrostasy, one of the points of attention is the forehead, because that's where thought exists in your brain. And when you're not thinking as much, you feel space here. I wear a hat. The hat interacts with my forehead, and so I can feel my forehead even better. So this creates a tactile form of touch that I can interact with my own brain. Now, when people ask why you're wearing a hat, I do what I call deliberate folly. And I say because I'm growing my hair out, which is also kind of true. I am growing my hair out. I'm just not getting it cut. But that's not necessarily the reason I'm wearing a hat. But
I love it.
But can you imagine if I'm at the clinic and someone says, why are you wearing a hat, Ernest? And well, it creates the overall sensitivity of my skull, which in sensing into my brain, I can feel that my mind is more relaxed because of a tactile sensory perception.
I'd love the look they'd give you, Ernest.
I'll take a picture of it because it would be a what the fuck is wrong with this guy? Look.
Lock this guy up, please.
My hat helps me modulate my vibrational output to 463.65 gigahertz, which is love.
There you go, an added bonus. Add that word.
I am making fun now. Let me stop the recording before I offend too many people.